Tonight we journey back to the darkest chapter in American history, to a time when brother fought brother, when families were torn apart by ideology, and when the very soul of a young nation hung in the balance. This is the story of the American Civil War, a conflict so devastating that it would claim more American lives than all other wars combined. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 1819, and the United States of America sat precariously balanced on a knife's edge. 11 free states, 11 slave states. From the outside, it appeared to be perfect harmony, a delicate equilibrium that kept the young republic functioning. But beneath this veneer of balance, something far more sinister was brewing. The nation that had declared all men created equal was grappling with the fundamental contradiction at its very heart. How could a country founded on liberty continue to enslave 4 million human beings? The Founding Fathers had known this day would come. Thomas Jefferson himself had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but fear of losing Southern support had forced its removal. They had kicked the can down the road, hoping future generations would solve what they could not. But now, as the nation expanded westward, that reckoning had arrived with the force of a thunderclap. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had seemed like a solution at the time. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as free, and a line would be drawn across the continent at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. Everything above would be free, everything below open to slavery. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, had orchestrated this delicate dance, believing he had solved the slavery question once and for all. How wrong he was. But even as politicians celebrated their clever solution, the economic and cultural divide between North and South was widening like a chasm. The North was industrializing rapidly, its cities filling with immigrants from Ireland and Germany, its factories humming with the promise of progress. The South remained agricultural, its economy built on the backs of enslaved people who worked vast plantations under the scorching sun. Cotton was king, and slavery was its crown. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had transformed the South's economy overnight. What had once been a labor-intensive process of separating cotton fibers from seeds could now be done mechanically, making cotton production incredibly profitable. But this technological advancement came with a terrible cost. It made slavery more entrenched, more valuable, more defended than ever before. The peculiar institution, as Southerners euphemistically called it, was no longer just a social system, but the foundation of their entire way of life. In the North, a different revolution was taking place. The Second Great Awakening had swept through the region like wildfire, bringing with it a renewed emphasis on moral reform and social justice. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison published fiery newspapers condemning slavery as a sin against God and humanity. The Underground Railroad, that secret network of safe houses and brave conductors, helped thousands of enslaved people escape to freedom in the North and Canada. Yet even among Northerners, attitudes toward slavery were complex and often contradictory. Many opposed slavery not out of concern for Black Americans, but from fear that slave labor would undercut white workers' wages. Others worried that the expansion of slavery would concentrate too much political power in the hands of Southern planters. The moral argument against slavery, while growing stronger, was still just one voice in a cacophony of economic and political concerns. The tension was palpable in the halls of Congress, where representatives from North and South eyed each other with growing suspicion. Every new territory that applied for statehood threatened to upset the delicate balance. Every debate over tariffs or internal improvements became a proxy war between competing visions of America's future. The center was not holding, and thoughtful observers on both sides began to wonder if the Union could survive. In the slave quarters of Southern plantations, 4 million African Americans lived in bondage, their lives controlled by masters who could buy, sell, whip, or kill them with impunity. Families were torn apart at auction blocks, children sold away from their parents, husbands separated from wives. The psychological trauma of slavery was as devastating as its physical brutality. Yet even in the depths of oppression, enslaved people maintained their humanity, their culture, their hope for freedom. They sang spirituals that spoke of deliverance, told stories that preserved their heritage, and never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would be free. The free black population in the North faced its own challenges. While legally free, they encountered discrimination at every turn. Most states denied them the right to vote, serve on juries, or attend public schools. They were barred from many occupations and forced to live in segregated neighborhoods. Yet they persevered, building churches, schools, and businesses, and becoming some of the most eloquent voices in the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery but self-educated and brilliant, became one of the most powerful orators of his generation, his speeches and writings exposing the horrors of slavery to audiences across the North and Europe. As the 1840s dawned, the question of slavery's expansion became increasingly urgent. The Mexican-American War had added vast new territories to the United States, and the question of whether these lands would be slave or free could no longer be avoided. The Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery from all territory acquired from Mexico, passed the House of Representatives but died in the Senate. The battle lines were being drawn, and compromise was becoming increasingly difficult. The Compromise of 1850 was Henry Clay's last great attempt to hold the Union together. California would enter as a free state. The territories of Utah and New Mexico would decide the slavery question for themselves through popular sovereignty. The slave trade would be abolished in Washington, D.C., and a stronger Fugitive Slave Act would require Northerners to help capture and return escaped slaves. It was a complex package that gave something to both sides while satisfying neither. The Fugitive Slave Act proved particularly inflammatory in the North. Suddenly, free black Americans could be seized on the streets and dragged back into slavery with minimal legal protection. White Northerners who had previously been indifferent to slavery found themselves forced to participate in its enforcement or face criminal charges. The law turned every Northern community into a potential battleground between slave catchers and abolitionists. Harriet Beecher, Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, brought the reality of slavery into Northern parlors with unprecedented emotional power. The book sold over 300,000 copies in its first year and was adapted for the stage across the North. Southerners denounced it as propaganda and lies, but its impact on Northern public opinion was undeniable. When Stowe met President Lincoln years later, he allegedly told her, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 shattered the Missouri Compromise and opened the floodgates to violence. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, eager to build a transcontinental railroad through his home state, proposed organizing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska under the principle of popular sovereignty. This meant that the question of slavery would be decided by the settlers themselves, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise's prohibition of slavery north of the 3630 line. The reaction was swift and furious. Northern politicians denounced the act as a betrayal of sacred compromises. Southern politicians saw it as an opportunity to expand slavery into new territories. But it was in Kansas itself that the consequences would be most dramatically felt. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, known as border ruffians, poured across the border to vote in territorial elections. Anti-slavery settlers, many sponsored by Northern immigrant aid societies, established their own communities and prepared to fight for Kansas's soul. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a preview of the larger conflict to come. Elections were marred by fraud and violence. Two rival governments claimed legitimacy. Armed bands roamed the territory, burning homes and murdering opponents. The violence reached its peak in May 1856, when pro-slavery forces sacked the Free State town of Lawrence, destroying printing presses and burning buildings. 3 days later, a radical abolitionist named John Brown led a midnight raid on pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek. Brown and his followers dragged 5 men from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. The Pottawatomie Massacre, as it became known, sent shockwaves across the nation and marked Brown as one of the most controversial figures of his era. To abolitionists, he was a righteous warrior against the sin of slavery. To Southerners, he was a terrorist and a madman. The violence in Kansas was mirrored by growing tensions in Washington. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a blistering speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he personally attacked several Southern senators, including Andrew Butler of South Carolina. 2 days later, Butler's nephew, Representative Preston Brooks, entered the Senate chamber and beat Sumner senseless with a gold-headed cane. Sumner's injuries were so severe that he could not return to the Senate for over 3 years, but Massachusetts kept his seat empty as a symbol of Southern brutality. The caning of Sumner became a rallying cry for both sections. Northerners were horrified by what they saw as an attack on free speech and democratic institutions. Southerners praised Brooks as a defender of Southern honor and sent him dozens of replacement canes. The incident perfectly captured the breakdown of civil discourse and the growing resort to violence in American politics. The Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857 dealt another devastating blow to the anti-slavery cause. Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority, declared that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States, and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. The Missouri Compromise was declared unconstitutional, and the federal government was effectively prohibited from interfering with slavery anywhere in the nation. The decision was a legal and political earthquake. Republicans denounced it as a conspiracy to nationalize slavery. Stephen Douglas found himself in the impossible position of defending popular sovereignty when the court had declared that territorial legislatures had no power to exclude slavery. Abraham Lincoln, still a relatively unknown lawyer and politician from Illinois, began to emerge as a powerful voice against the decision and its implications. Lincoln's famous House Divided speech, delivered upon accepting the Republican nomination for Senate in 1858, crystallized the growing belief that the slavery question could no longer be compromised away. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," Lincoln declared. "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." The Lincoln-Douglas debates that followed during the 1858 Senate campaign brought national attention to both men and helped define the terms of the slavery debate. Douglas defended popular sovereignty and tried to portray Lincoln as a radical abolitionist. Lincoln carefully distinguished between his personal opposition to slavery and his constitutional obligations, but he made clear his belief that slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to expand. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates established him as a national figure and a leading voice of the Republican Party. His careful, reasoned arguments against slavery's expansion, combined with his obvious political skill, made him an attractive candidate for higher office. The stage was being set for the election of 1860, which would determine not just who would be president, but whether the Union would survive. The autumn of 1859 brought with it an event that would push the nation past the point of no return. John Brown, the same man who had orchestrated the Potawatomi massacre in Kansas, had spent the intervening years planning something far more ambitious and dangerous. He envisioned a slave uprising that would spread across the South like wildfire, liberating millions of enslaved people and bringing the peculiar institution to its knees. Brown's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. He would seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, arm the local slave population, and establish a stronghold in the Blue Ridge Mountains from which he could launch raids throughout the South. It was the stuff of Southern nightmares made manifest, and it would have consequences far beyond what even Brown could have imagined. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and 21 followers, including 5 black men and 3 of his own sons, crossed the Potomac River and seized the arsenal. They cut telegraph wires, captured several prominent local citizens as hostages, and waited for enslaved people to flock to their banner. But the uprising Brown expected never materialized. Instead, local militia surrounded the arsenal, and federal troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived to end the standoff. The assault on the engine house where Brown and his men had taken refuge was swift and decisive. 10 of Brown's followers were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown himself was wounded and captured, along with several others. The raid had lasted less than 36 hours, but its impact would reverberate for years to come. Brown's trial became a national sensation. Lying on a cot in the courtroom, wounded but defiant, he transformed himself from a failed insurrectionist into a martyr for the abolitionist cause. His final speech to the court was a masterpiece of moral conviction. "If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So, let it be done." The reaction to Brown's raid and execution revealed the depth of the chasm between North and South. In the North, church bells tolled on the day of his execution, and he was hailed as a martyr who had died for the cause of human freedom. Ralph Waldo Emerson compared him to Jesus Christ, and Henry David Thoreau called him an angel of light. In the South, Brown was seen as the embodiment of Northern fanaticism, proof that abolitionists would stop at nothing to destroy Southern society. The raid had another crucial effect. It convinced many Southerners that they could no longer trust the federal government to protect their interests. If a handful of abolitionists could seize a federal arsenal and attempt to incite a slave rebellion, what would happen if the anti-slavery Republican Party gained control of the government? The answer, many Southerners believed, was the destruction of their way of life. As 1860 dawned, the Democratic Party, which had held the Union together through decades of compromise, began to fracture along sectional lines. The party's national convention in Charleston, South Carolina, became a battleground between Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, and Southern Democrats who demanded federal protection for slavery in the territories. When the convention failed to nominate Douglas, Southern delegates walked out, and the party split into Northern and Southern wings. The Republican Party, meanwhile, was gaining strength and confidence. Founded just 6 years earlier as an anti-slavery party, it had grown rapidly by appealing to Northern voters who opposed slavery's expansion. The party's platform for 1860 was carefully crafted to appeal to a broad coalition: opposition to slavery's expansion, support for a transcontinental railroad, higher tariffs to protect Northern industry, and free land for Western settlers. The Republican convention in Chicago was a raucous affair, with several candidates vying for the nomination. William Seward of New York was the early favorite, but his reputation as a radical on slavery made him vulnerable. Abraham Lincoln, the prairie lawyer from Illinois, emerged as a compromise candidate who could appeal to moderate voters while maintaining the party's anti-slavery principles. Lincoln's nomination sent shockwaves through the South. Here was a man who had declared that the Union could not endure half slave and half free, who had debated Stephen Douglas on the immorality of slavery, who represented a party dedicated to slavery's ultimate extinction. Southern newspapers denounced him as a black Republican who would destroy Southern civilization. Several Southern states began making preparations for secession even before the election was held. The campaign of 1860 was unlike any in American history. 4 candidates competed for the presidency: Lincoln for the Republicans, Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 Southern states, a clear indication of how divided the nation had become. Lincoln conducted a traditional front porch campaign, receiving visitors at his home in Springfield, Illinois, while his supporters organized torchlight parades and mass rallies across the North. He said little during the campaign, allowing his previous speeches and the Republican platform to speak for him. His silence was strategic. Anything he said would be twisted by his opponents to make him appear more radical than he was. The results of the election were decisive but ominous. Lincoln won a clear majority in the Electoral College with 180 votes, but he received less than 40% of the popular vote and virtually no support in the South. The election had revealed a nation so divided that no candidate could appeal to both sections. The center had not held, and the consequences would be catastrophic. South Carolina had been preparing for this moment for months. Even before the election results were official, the state legislature called for a secession convention. On December 20th, 1860, delegates meeting in Charleston unanimously voted to dissolve South Carolina's connection with the United States. The Palmetto State had fired the first shot in what would become a war of unprecedented destruction. The secession of South Carolina was followed by a cascade of similar actions across the Deep South. Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861, followed by Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1st, 7 states had left the Union, and delegates were gathering in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. The Confederate Convention moved quickly to establish a government. They adopted a constitution that was largely based on the U.S. Constitution, but with crucial differences. It explicitly protected slavery, limited the president to a single 6-year term, and gave greater rights to individual states. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a West Point graduate and former U.S. Senator, was chosen as president, with Alexander Stephens of Georgia as vice president. In his inaugural address, Stephens made clear what the Confederacy stood for. The new nation's cornerstone, he declared, rested upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. There could be no clearer statement of the Confederate cause or the fundamental issue that had torn the nation apart. Meanwhile, in Washington, the lame duck administration of James Buchanan struggled to respond to the crisis. Buchanan, a Pennsylvania Democrat who sympathized with the South, declared secession illegal, but claimed the federal government had no power to prevent it. His inaction allowed the Confederates to seize federal property throughout the South, including forts, arsenals, and custom houses. Abraham Lincoln, still president-elect, watched these events unfold with growing alarm. He had hoped that his election would not lead to disunion, and he continued to believe that most Southerners were loyal to the Union. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, he tried to reassure the South while making clear his determination to preserve the Union. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists," Lincoln declared. "I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." But he also made clear that he would not recognize secession. No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union. The Union was perpetual, and he would use all his constitutional powers to preserve it. Lincoln's words fell on deaf ears in the South. The Confederates had already moved beyond the point where presidential assurances could bring them back into the Union. They had created their own government, elected their own president, and were determined to establish their independence. The only question now was whether this could be accomplished peacefully, or would require war. The answer came at a small fort in Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter, built on an artificial island to defend the port, had become a symbol of federal authority in the heart of the Confederacy. Major Robert Anderson, the fort's commander, had moved his small garrison there from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie in December, angering South Carolinians who saw it as an act of aggression. The fort's situation was precarious. Anderson had fewer than 80 men and limited supplies, while Confederate forces surrounded the harbor. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: resupply the fort and risk war, or abandon it and appear to recognize Confederate independence. He chose a middle course, announcing that he would send supplies but no reinforcements to the fort. Confederate leaders saw this as their moment of truth. If they allowed federal forces to remain in Charleston Harbor, their claims of independence would be meaningless. On April 11th, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard demanded Anderson's surrender. When Anderson refused, Beauregard ordered his batteries to open fire. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a Confederate mortar shell arced through the darkness and exploded over Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had begun. For 34 hours, Confederate guns pounded the fort while Anderson's men returned fire as best they could. Miraculously, no one was killed during the bombardment, but the fort's situation was hopeless. On April 13th, Anderson surrendered, and the Stars and Stripes was lowered over Fort Sumter for the first time since the Revolution. The attack on Fort Sumter electrified the North. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, and men rushed to enlist in numbers that surprised even the most optimistic officials. The war that many had hoped to avoid was now inevitable, and both sides prepared for what they believed would be a short, decisive conflict. But the attack on Sumter also had another consequence. It pushed 4 more states into the Confederacy. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had initially rejected secession, but Lincoln's call for troops to coerce their sister states was more than they could bear. By June, 11 states had joined the Confederacy, and the battle lines were drawn. The war that began at Fort Sumter would last 4 years and claim over 600,000 lives. It would transform the United States from a loose confederation of states into a modern nation, end slavery forever, and establish the federal government's supremacy over the states. But in April 1861, none of this was foreseeable. Americans on both sides believed they were fighting for their most sacred principles, and they were prepared to pay any price for victory. The spring of 1861 found America transformed overnight from a nation at peace to one preparing for war. In the North, the attack on Fort Sumter had created a surge of patriotic fervor not seen since the Revolution. Young men lined up at recruiting stations, bands played martial music in town squares, and women organized sewing circles to make uniforms for the volunteers. The Union cause seemed righteous, and victory inevitable. But beneath the surface enthusiasm lay troubling realities. The United States Army numbered fewer than 16,000 men, most scattered across the western frontier fighting Indians. The Navy was small, and many of its officers were Southerners who had resigned their commissions. The government had no plans for a major war, no system for raising large armies, and no experience managing a conflict of the scale that was about to unfold. Abraham Lincoln, thrust into the presidency during the greatest crisis in American history, had never commanded so much as a company of soldiers. His military experience consisted of a brief stint in the Black Hawk War 30 years earlier, during which he saw no combat and later joked that his only battles were with mosquitoes. Yet this prairie lawyer would have to learn the art of war while conducting it, making life and death decisions that would affect millions of people. The president's first challenge was holding the border states in the Union. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware all had significant pro-Confederate populations, and their loss would be catastrophic. Maryland's secession would leave Washington, D.C. surrounded by enemy territory. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River and much of the Mississippi. Missouri commanded the gateway to the west. Lincoln would have to use a combination of political skill, military force, and constitutional flexibility to keep these states loyal. In Maryland, pro-Confederate mobs attacked Union troops passing through Baltimore on their way to defend Washington. Lincoln responded by suspending the writ of habeas corpus and arresting suspected secessionists, including members of the state legislature. When Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that only Congress could suspend habeas corpus, Lincoln ignored him. The Constitution, Lincoln argued, was not a suicide pact, and extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. Kentucky presented a different challenge. The state declared neutrality, hoping to avoid the war altogether. Both Union and Confederate forces respected this neutrality at first, but it couldn't last. When Confederate forces occupied Columbus, Kentucky in September 1861, Union General Ulysses S. Grant immediately seized Paducah and Cairo. Kentucky's neutrality was over, and the state remained in the Union, though thousands of its sons would fight for the Confederacy. Missouri descended into a vicious civil war within the Civil War. The pro-Union governor, Nathaniel Lyon, clashed with pro-Confederate state militia, leading to battles at Wilson's Creek and Lexington. Guerrilla warfare erupted across the state, with bands of Confederate bushwhackers and Union jayhawkers terrorizing civilians and burning towns. The violence in Missouri would continue throughout the war and beyond, creating lasting scars that would take generations to heal. While Lincoln struggled to hold the Union together, Jefferson Davis faced his own challenges in Richmond, the new Confederate capital. The Confederacy had been born in haste, and its government was still taking shape. Davis, a West Point graduate and former Secretary of War, brought military experience to the presidency, but he also brought a prickly personality and a tendency to micromanage that would create problems throughout the war. The Confederate Constitution gave individual states more power than the U.S. Constitution, reflecting Southern beliefs about states' rights. But this decentralization would prove problematic during wartime, when quick decisions and unified action were essential. Georgia's governor, Joseph Brown, would spend much of the war feuding with Davis over conscription and other federal policies. South Carolina's governor would refuse to allow his state's troops to serve outside South Carolina. The Confederacy's commitment to states' rights would undermine its ability to wage war effectively. Both sides faced the enormous challenge of creating armies from scratch. The Union had significant advantages in population, industry, and resources, but these had to be mobilized and organized. The North's population of 22 million dwarfed the South's 9 million, of whom nearly 4 million were enslaved and could not be armed. Northern factories could produce weapons, uniforms, and equipment, while the South had to rely on imports or capture Union supplies. The railroad network told a similar story. The North had over 20,000 miles of track, connecting its cities and facilitating the movement of troops and supplies. The South had only 9,000 miles of track, much of it in poor condition and using different gauges that prevented through traffic. The North's railroad system would prove crucial to its victory, allowing it to move armies quickly and keep them supplied over vast distances. But the South had advantages too. It was fighting a defensive war on familiar territory with shorter supply lines and the support of the local population. Southern men had a strong military tradition and were experienced with horses and firearms. Many of the Army's best officers, including Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Joseph E. Johnston, had resigned their commissions to join the Confederacy. The first major battle of the war came sooner than anyone expected. Public pressure in the North demanded action, and newspapers cried, "On to Richmond!" Lincoln's commanding general, Winfield Scott, preferred a slower strategy of blockading southern ports and controlling the Mississippi River, but political pressure forced him to authorize an advance on the Confederate capital. General Irvin McDowell led 35,000 Union troops south from Washington toward the Confederate Army gathered near Manassas Junction, Virginia. The Confederates, under General P.G.T. Beauregard, had about 20,000 men, but they were expecting reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley under General Joseph E. Johnston. The stage was set for the first major battle of the Civil War. On July 21, 1861, the two armies clashed along Bull Run Creek in what became known as the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas to the Confederates. Civilians from Washington, including congressmen and their families, rode out in carriages to watch the battle, expecting to see a quick Union victory that would end the rebellion. The battle began well for the Union. McDowell's flanking attack caught the Confederates by surprise, and for several hours it appeared the Union would win. But Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad, and a Virginia brigade under Colonel Thomas J. Jackson stood firm against repeated Union attacks. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall," shouted General Barnard Bee, giving Jackson the nickname that would make him famous. As the day wore on, the tide turned against the Union. Fresh Confederate troops launched a counterattack that broke the Union line. What had been an orderly retreat quickly became a rout, with Union soldiers streaming back toward Washington in panic. The civilians who had come to watch the battle found themselves caught up in the retreat, their carriages clogging the roads and adding to the confusion. The defeat at Bull Run was a sobering shock to the North. The war would not be over in 90 days, as many had predicted. The Confederate Army was not a rabble of rebels, but a formidable fighting force. Lincoln realized he would need a larger army, better generals, and a long-term strategy to win the war. The president turned to General George B. McClellan, a young officer who had won some small victories in Western Virginia. McClellan was a superb organizer and trainer of troops, and he quickly set about transforming the mob of volunteers around Washington into a real army. He drilled them relentlessly, improved their equipment and supplies, and instilled discipline and pride. The Army of the Potomac, as it became known, would become one of the finest fighting forces in American history. But McClellan had a fatal flaw. He was overly cautious and constantly overestimated enemy strength. He believed he faced twice as many Confederates as he actually did, and he was reluctant to attack unless he had overwhelming superiority. This caution would frustrate Lincoln and prolong the war, but it also saved the Union from potentially catastrophic defeats early in the conflict. While McClellan trained his army, the war expanded to other theaters. In the West, Union forces under General Nathaniel Lyon were defeated at Wilson's Creek in Missouri, and Lyon was killed in the battle. Confederate forces invaded Kentucky, threatening to bring that crucial state into the rebellion. Naval battles erupted along the coast as the Union tried to implement its blockade of southern ports. The blockade, part of General Scott's Anaconda Plan, was designed to strangle the Confederacy economically by cutting off its trade with Europe. The South depended on cotton exports to finance its war effort and needed to import weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. If the Union could seal off southern ports, it could slowly squeeze the life out of the rebellion, but the blockade faced enormous challenges. The southern coastline stretched for 3,500 miles and included dozens of ports and inlets. The Union Navy had only 42 ships in commission at the start of the war, and many were obsolete sailing vessels. Building an effective blockade would require a massive expansion of the Navy and the development of new technologies. The first major success came at Hatteras Inlet in North Carolina, where a joint Army-Navy expedition captured 2 Confederate forts in August 1861. The victory gave the Union a foothold on the southern coast and demonstrated the effectiveness of combined operations. Similar expeditions would follow, gradually tightening the noose around the Confederacy. The war also took on an international dimension as both sides sought foreign recognition and support. The Confederacy hoped that European dependence on southern cotton would force Britain and France to intervene on its behalf. The Union worked to prevent foreign recognition of the Confederacy and to keep European powers neutral. The crisis came to a head in November 1861 with the Trent Affair. A Union warship stopped the British mail steamer Trent and removed 2 Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, who were traveling to Europe to seek recognition for the Confederacy. The British government was outraged by this violation of neutral rights and demanded the release of the diplomats and an apology. For several weeks, war between the United States and Britain seemed possible. The British sent troops to Canada and prepared their fleet for action. But cooler heads prevailed, and Lincoln's administration agreed to release the diplomats and apologize for the incident. "One war at a time," Lincoln reportedly said, recognizing that the Union could not afford to fight both the Confederacy and the British Empire. As 1861 drew to a close, both sides settled in for what was clearly going to be a long and bloody conflict. The initial enthusiasm for war had given way to a grim determination to see it through to the end. Families were already mourning their dead, and the economic costs of the war were mounting. But there was no turning back now. The die had been cast, and the fate of the nation would be decided on the battlefields of the coming years. The winter of 1861 to 1862 was a time of preparation and planning. Both armies used the lull in fighting to train recruits, gather supplies, and plan their next moves. In Washington, Lincoln struggled with the enormous burdens of wartime leadership, dealing with demanding generals, fractious politicians, and a public that wanted quick results. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis faced similar challenges, complicated by the Confederacy's weak central government and the need to create a nation while fighting a war. The stage was set for the campaigns of 1862, which would see the war expand in scope and intensity. New technologies would be tested, new strategies would be tried, and new heroes would emerge. The American Civil War was about to enter its bloodiest phase, and the nation would never be the same. The year 1862 dawned with both armies poised for action after months of preparation and training. The Union had used the winter to build its forces and develop a comprehensive strategy for victory. The Confederacy, meanwhile, had strengthened its defenses and prepared for what its leaders knew would be a desperate struggle for survival. In the Western theater, a relatively unknown Union general named Ulysses S. Grant was about to make his mark on history. Grant had struggled in civilian life after graduating from West Point, failing at farming and business before the war rescued him from obscurity. But he possessed qualities that would make him one of the greatest military commanders in American history: determination, strategic vision, and an understanding that war was ultimately about destroying the enemy's will to fight. Grant's first major success came at Fort Henry on the Tennessee River in February 1862. The fort was poorly positioned and quickly fell to Union gunboats, opening the Tennessee River to Union navigation. More importantly, it gave Grant the opportunity to attack Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, which controlled access to Nashville, the Confederate capital of Tennessee. The siege of Fort Donelson became Grant's first real test as a commander. The Confederate garrison, led by Grant's old friend from West Point, Simon Bolivar Buckner, was trapped and facing inevitable defeat. When Buckner asked for terms, Grant's reply became legendary. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The fall of Fort Donelson was a devastating blow to the Confederacy. Nashville fell without a fight, and Confederate forces were forced to retreat across Tennessee. Grant became a national hero overnight, earning the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. More importantly, the victory opened the way for Union forces to penetrate deep into the Confederate heartland. But Grant's greatest test was yet to come. In April 1862, Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack on Grant's army at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, near a small church called Shiloh. The attack caught the Union forces completely off guard, and for a time it seemed the Confederates might win a decisive victory. The Battle of Shiloh was unlike anything Americans had experienced before. The fighting was savage and confused, with units becoming lost in the thick woods and attacking their own men by mistake. General Johnston, one of the Confederacy's most promising commanders, was killed early in the battle, bleeding to death from a wound in his leg that he might have survived if he had received proper medical attention. Grant's army was pushed back to the Tennessee River, and many of his subordinates urged him to retreat. But Grant refused to give up. "Retreat?" he reportedly said. "No. I propose to attack at daylight and whip them." Reinforced by General Don Carlos Buell's army during the night, Grant launched a counterattack the next morning that drove the Confederates from the field. The casualties at Shiloh were staggering, over 13,000 Union losses and nearly 11,000 Confederate. It was the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point, and it gave both sides a glimpse of the carnage to come. Grant was criticized for being caught by surprise, but Lincoln defended him. "I can't spare this man. He fights." While Grant was winning victories in the West, the situation in the East remained frustrating for the Union. General McClellan had spent months training and organizing the Army of the Potomac, but he seemed reluctant to use it. Lincoln grew increasingly impatient with McClellan's delays and excuses, famously writing, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." Finally, in March 1862, McClellan launched his Peninsula Campaign, transporting his army by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and advancing on Richmond from the southeast. The plan was sound in theory, but McClellan's execution was flawed by his characteristic overcaution and his tendency to overestimate enemy strength. The Peninsula Campaign began promisingly, with Union forces advancing to within sight of Richmond's church spires. But McClellan hesitated to deliver the final blow, convinced that he was outnumbered by Confederate forces that were actually smaller than his own. This hesitation gave the Confederates time to organize their defenses and bring in reinforcements. The Confederate defense of Richmond was complicated by a change in command. General Joseph E. Johnston, who had been leading Confederate forces on the peninsula, was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines in late May. Jefferson Davis replaced him with Robert E. Lee, a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential of the war. Lee was 55 years old and had spent most of his career as an engineer and staff officer. He had opposed secession and had been offered command of Union forces at the beginning of the war, but his loyalty to Virginia led him to resign from the U.S. Army and join the Confederacy. Many questioned Davis's choice, as Lee had not distinguished himself in his previous commands in Western Virginia and South Carolina. But Lee would prove to be a military genius, perhaps the finest tactical commander in American history. He understood that the Confederacy could not win a war of attrition against the more populous and industrialized North. Instead, he would have to take risks, use audacious tactics, and hope to win decisive victories that would break Northern morale and bring foreign intervention. Lee's first major action was the 7 Days Battles, a series of attacks on McClellan's army in late June 1862. The battles were costly for both sides, but Lee achieved his strategic objective of forcing McClellan to retreat from Richmond. The Peninsula Campaign, which had promised so much, ended in failure for the Union. McClellan's retreat was a bitter disappointment to Lincoln and the Northern public. The general who had been hailed as the young Napoleon had failed to capture Richmond despite having every advantage. Lincoln began to lose confidence in McClellan, though he would give him one more chance to prove himself. The failure of the Peninsula Campaign had broader implications for Union strategy. It became clear that the war would not be won quickly or easily, and that the Union would need to mobilize all its resources for a prolonged struggle. Congress passed the first conscription act in American history, though it allowed wealthy men to hire substitutes or pay a $300 commutation fee, leading to complaints that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The war was also beginning to transform American society in fundamental ways. The demands of the conflict were breaking down traditional barriers and creating new opportunities for previously marginalized groups. Women took on new roles as nurses, factory workers, and even spies. The famous nurse Clara Barton would later found the American Red Cross based on her experiences during the Civil War. African Americans, both free and enslaved, saw the war as an opportunity to strike a blow for freedom. Thousands of enslaved people fled to Union lines where they were classified as contraband and put to work supporting the war effort. Free black men in the North petitioned for the right to serve in the Army, though they would not be allowed to do so until later in the war. The question of slavery was becoming increasingly central to the war effort. Radical Republicans in Congress pushed for emancipation, arguing that slavery was the root cause of the rebellion and that it must be destroyed to ensure lasting peace. Lincoln was more cautious, fearing that premature action on slavery would drive the border states into the Confederacy and alienate conservative Northern Democrats. But events were forcing Lincoln's hand. The war was lasting longer and costing more than anyone had anticipated. If the Union was going to ask its citizens to make such enormous sacrifices, it needed a cause more inspiring than simply preserving the status quo. Emancipation would give the war a moral dimension that would rally Northern support and prevent European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. The military situation also argued for emancipation. Enslaved people were a crucial resource for the Confederacy, working in fields and factories while white men fought in the Army. If the Union could turn this resource against the Confederacy by promising freedom to enslaved people, it would strike a devastating blow at the Southern war effort. Lincoln began drafting an Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862, but his advisors convinced him to wait for a military victory before announcing it. A proclamation issued after a defeat would look like an act of desperation, while one issued after a victory would appear to be a position of strength. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Emboldened by his success in defending Richmond, Lee decided to take the war to the north. In September 1862, he led his army across the Potomac River into Maryland, hoping to win a decisive victory on northern soil that would bring European recognition and perhaps end the war. Lee's invasion of Maryland was a calculated gamble. His army was tired and poorly supplied after months of campaigning, and many of his men were barefoot and in rags. But Lee believed that a victory in Maryland could change the entire course of the war. European powers were watching closely, and a Confederate victory on northern soil might convince them to recognize Southern independence. The campaign began well for Lee. His army crossed into Maryland without opposition, and he issued a proclamation calling on Marylanders to join the Confederate cause. But Lee's plans went awry when a copy of his orders was found by Union soldiers, wrapped around 3 cigars and left at an abandoned Confederate campsite. The lost orders revealed that Lee had divided his army, sending part of it to capture the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry while the rest continued north. McClellan, for once, moved quickly to take advantage of this intelligence, advancing to attack Lee's divided forces. The two armies met at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 17, 1862. The Battle of Antietam would prove to be the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties. The fighting was savage and confused, with both sides launching desperate attacks and counterattacks across the rolling Maryland countryside. The battle began at dawn, with a Union attack on the Confederate left flank near Dunker Church. The fighting surged back and forth through the cornfields, with entire regiments being cut down in minutes. The 1st Texas Infantry entered the battle with 226 men and emerged with only 40. The corn was cut down as if by a giant scythe, and the field was carpeted with bodies. The center of the Confederate line held a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane after Union forces finally broke through and filled it with Confederate dead. The Confederate right flank was anchored at Antietam Creek, where a narrow stone bridge became the focus of repeated Union attacks. The bridge, later renamed Antietam Creek Bridge in honor of the battle, was finally captured after hours of fighting. Despite suffering enormous casualties, Lee's army held its ground throughout the day. But the Confederate position was precarious, with the armies back to the Potomac River and no room for retreat. That night, Lee made the difficult decision to withdraw back into Virginia, ending the Maryland campaign. Antietam was a strategic victory for the Union, even though McClellan failed to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army. The Confederate invasion had been turned back, European recognition of the Confederacy was postponed indefinitely, and Lincoln finally had the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced that all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion on January 1, 1863, would be forever free. The proclamation was carefully crafted to avoid alienating the border states, applying only to areas under Confederate control, but its symbolic importance was enormous, transforming the war from a conflict about union to a crusade for human freedom. The reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation was mixed. Abolitionists praised it as a great step forward, while conservatives criticized it as unconstitutional and radical. In the South, it was denounced as an incitement to slave rebellion and proof of Northern fanaticism. But the proclamation achieved its main objectives. It rallied Northern morale, prevented European intervention, and began the process of turning the war into a moral crusade. The proclamation also opened the door for African American military service. Free black men in the North had been trying to enlist since the beginning of the war, but they had been turned away. Now, with emancipation official policy, the Union began recruiting black soldiers in earnest. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans would serve in the Union Army and Navy, playing a crucial role in their own liberation. The year 1862 ended with mixed results for both sides. The Union had made significant gains in the West, capturing New Orleans, Memphis, and much of Tennessee. But in the East, the Army of the Potomac had suffered a devastating defeat at Fredericksburg in December, where Ambrose Burnside, who had replaced McClellan, launched futile frontal attacks against impregnable Confederate positions. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a slaughter, with over 12,000 Union casualties compared to fewer than 5,000 Confederate. The defeat was so complete that Confederate General James Longstreet later wrote, "The Federals had been throwing men away so recklessly that I began to believe they had an unlimited supply." The battle destroyed Burnside's reputation and left the Army of the Potomac demoralized and leaderless. As 1863 began, both sides prepared for what they knew would be the decisive year of the war. The Union had the resources and manpower to win, but it needed better leadership and a clearer strategy. The Confederacy was running short of men and supplies, but it still had excellent generals and the advantage of fighting on home ground. The stage was set for the campaigns that would determine the fate of the nation. The winter of 1862 to 1863 was a time of crisis and soul-searching for the Union. The Army of the Potomac, bloodied and demoralized after the disaster at Fredericksburg, huddled in winter quarters across the Rappahannock River from Lee's Confederates. Desertions were rampant, with some regiments losing half their strength to men who simply walked away from the war. Abraham Lincoln faced the darkest period of his presidency. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, but its effects were not yet apparent. Democrats had made significant gains in the midterm elections, running on a platform of peace and compromise. Radical Republicans criticized Lincoln for not prosecuting the war vigorously enough, while conservative Democrats accused him of turning the conflict into an abolitionist crusade that would never end. The president's personal life was also in turmoil. His wife Mary was struggling with mental illness, made worse by the death of their son Willie from typhoid fever in February 1862. Lincoln himself was showing the strain of command, his face becoming more gaunt and lined with each passing month. Visitors to the White House were shocked by his appearance, describing him as looking like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But Lincoln's greatest challenge was finding generals who could match Robert E. Lee's tactical brilliance. Ambrose Burnside, the latest in a series of failed commanders of the Army of the Potomac, had proven himself incompetent at Fredericksburg. His replacement, Joseph Hooker, was a hard-drinking, boastful general known as Fighting Joe, who promised to restore the Army's morale and win decisive victories. Hooker did succeed in improving the Army's condition during the winter months. He reformed the supply system, granted furloughs to deserving soldiers, and reorganized the cavalry into an effective fighting force. By spring, The Army of the Potomac was larger and better equipped than ever before, with over 130,000 men ready for action. Hooker's plan for the spring campaign was ambitious and well-conceived. He would leave a third of his army to pin Lee's forces at Fredericksburg while taking the rest on a wide flanking movement through the wilderness of Spotsylvania. This would force Lee to abandon his strong defensive positions and fight on ground of Hooker's choosing. It was exactly the kind of bold, aggressive strategy that Lincoln had been hoping to see. The campaign began promisingly in late April 1863. Hooker's flanking force crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers without opposition and concentrated near a crossroads tavern called Chancellorsville. Lee was caught off guard by the movement and seemed to be in an impossible position, threatened from two directions by superior forces. But Lee's response to the crisis demonstrated why he was considered one of history's great military commanders. Rather than retreat or try to defend everywhere, he made the audacious decision to divide his already outnumbered army. Leaving a small force to watch the Union troops at Fredericksburg, he marched the bulk of his army west to confront Hooker at Chancellorsville. The Battle of Chancellorsville began on May 1, 1863, when Lee's advance guard encountered Hooker's forces emerging from the wilderness. To everyone's surprise, Hooker ordered his men to fall back into defensive positions, surrendering the initiative to Lee. Fighting Joe had lost his nerve at the crucial moment, and Lee was quick to take advantage. That evening, Lee made an even more daring decision. Based on intelligence from local guides, he learned that the Union right flank was in the air, unprotected and vulnerable to attack. He decided to divide his army again, sending Stonewall Jackson with 26,000 men on a 12-mile march around the Union flank, while he held Hooker's attention with the remaining 17,000. Jackson's flank march on May 2nd was one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. For hours, his column snaked through the dense woods of the wilderness, following obscure paths and logging roads. Union observers spotted parts of the column and reported it to Hooker, but the Union commander assumed Lee was retreating and made no effort to interfere. Late in the afternoon, Jackson's men emerged from the woods and formed for attack. The Union 11th Corps, composed largely of German immigrants, was completely unprepared for what was about to hit them. Many of the soldiers were cooking dinner or playing cards when the Confederate battle cry echoed through the forest, and thousands of gray-clad soldiers burst from the trees. The attack was devastating. The entire 11th Corps collapsed in panic, streaming back through the woods in complete disorder. Jackson's men pursued relentlessly, rolling up the Union line and threatening to cut off Hooker's entire army. For a few hours it seemed that Lee might win the most complete victory of the war, but tragedy struck the Confederate cause at the moment of its greatest triumph. Jackson, riding forward in the darkness to reconnoiter the Union positions, was shot by his own men, who mistook his party for Union cavalry. The wounds were severe, requiring the amputation of his left arm, and Jackson would die of pneumonia 8 days later. The loss of Stonewall Jackson was a devastating blow to the Confederacy. Lee called him his right arm, and his death deprived the Confederate Army of its most aggressive and capable corps commander. "I have lost my right arm," Lee said when he learned of Jackson's death. "But you have lost your left," Jackson reportedly replied, referring to his amputated limb. Despite Jackson's wounding, the Battle of Chancellorsville continued for 2 more days. Lee pressed his attacks against Hooker's demoralized forces, while simultaneously dealing with a Union assault on his rear guard at Fredericksburg. It was a masterpiece of tactical coordination, with Lee managing to defeat forces twice the size of his own army. Hooker, thoroughly beaten and possibly suffering from a concussion after a Confederate shell struck his headquarters, ordered a retreat across the Rappahannock. The Army of the Potomac had suffered another humiliating defeat, losing over 17,000 men while inflicting only 13,000 casualties on Lee's army. It was Lee's greatest victory, but it came at a terrible cost in irreplaceable officers and men. The victory at Chancellorsville convinced Lee that the time was right for another invasion of the North. The Army of Northern Virginia was at the peak of its power, having just defeated a much larger Union force. Northern morale was at a low ebb, and there were growing calls for peace negotiations. A decisive victory on Northern soil might bring European recognition, encourage Northern peace Democrats, and perhaps end the war on Confederate terms. Lee's second invasion of the North began in June 1863, with his army moving through the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Confederate advance created panic in the North, with militia units called out and government officials preparing to evacuate Washington and Harrisburg. For the first time since the Revolution, a foreign army was marching through Pennsylvania. The invasion also forced Lincoln to make another change in command of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker, still smarting from his defeat at Chancellorsville, got into a dispute with the War Department over the garrison at Harper's Ferry and offered his resignation. To his surprise, Lincoln accepted it, replacing him with General George Gordon Meade, a competent but unspectacular corps commander. Meade had only 3 days to take command of the army and pursue Lee into Pennsylvania. It was a daunting task, made more difficult by the fact that neither army knew exactly where the other was located. Lee's cavalry, under J.E.B. Stuart, had gone off on a raid around the Union Army and was out of communication, leaving Lee blind to Union movements. The two armies stumbled into each other at the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. Neither commander had intended to fight there, but the collision of advance units quickly escalated into a major battle. The town sat at the intersection of several roads, making it strategically important, and both sides rushed reinforcements to the scene. The first day of fighting went well for the Confederates. They drove Union forces through the town and onto the high ground south of Gettysburg, including Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. But Lee's subordinates failed to press their advantage, allowing the Union forces to establish strong defensive positions on what became known as the Fishhook Line. That evening, both armies concentrated their forces for what everyone knew would be a decisive battle. Lee had about 75,000 men, while Meade commanded approximately 90,000. The Union position was strong, occupying high ground with good fields of fire, but Lee was confident that his veterans could break through anywhere he chose to attack. The second day of the battle, July 2nd, saw Lee attempt to turn both flanks of the Union line. James Longstreet's corps attacked the Union left at Little Round Top in the wheat field, while Richard Ewell's corps assaulted the Union right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. The fighting was savage, with both sides suffering enormous casualties, but the Union line held. The hero of Little Round Top was Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry. When his regiment ran out of ammunition during repeated Confederate attacks, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge that broke the Confederate assault and saved the Union left flank. His actions would earn him the Medal of Honor and make him one of the most celebrated heroes of the war. Lee's attacks on the second day had come close to success but had ultimately failed. A lesser general might have retreated, but Lee was convinced that one more assault would break the Union line. He decided to attack the center of the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, believing that Meade had weakened his center to reinforce his flanks. The third day of Gettysburg, July 3rd, began with a massive artillery bombardment designed to soften the Union center. For 2 hours, 150 Confederate guns pounded the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge in what was probably the largest artillery barrage ever seen in North America. The Union guns replied, and the sound of the cannonade could be heard 25 miles away. When the artillery fire slackened, 15,000 Confederate infantry under General George Pickett began their advance across the open fields toward Cemetery Ridge. It was a magnificent and terrible sight. Long lines of gray-clad soldiers marching in perfect order toward the Union positions, their battle flags flying and their officers mounted and conspicuous. But Pickett's charge, as it became known, was doomed from the start. The Union artillery had not been silenced, and as the Confederate lines advanced, they were torn apart by canister and grape shot. Union infantry, protected by stone walls and earthworks, poured devastating volleys into the advancing ranks. Only a few hundred Confederates reached the Union line, and they were quickly overwhelmed. The repulse of Pickett's charge marked the high tide of the Confederacy. Lee's army had suffered over 28,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting, losses it could not afford. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again be strong enough to invade the North or win a decisive victory. The war had reached its turning point. Lee accepted full responsibility for the defeat, telling his men, "It is all my fault." He offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, but the Confederate president refused to accept it. There was no one else who could command the Army of Northern Virginia, and Davis knew that Lee's leadership was essential to the Confederate cause, even in defeat. Meade's failure to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army was a source of great frustration to Lincoln. The president believed that the war could have been ended at Gettysburg if Meade had been more aggressive. "We had them within our grasp," Lincoln said. "We had only to stretch forth our hands and they were ours." But Meade, like so many Union generals before him, was content with a defensive victory and let the opportunity slip away. The Battle of Gettysburg was not the only Union victory in July 1863. On July 4th, the same day Lee began his retreat from Pennsylvania, Ulysses S. Grant finally captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, after a siege lasting 47 days. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two and cutting off Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the South. The siege of Vicksburg had been a masterpiece of strategy and logistics. Grant had tried several approaches to the city, which sat on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River and was considered impregnable. Finally, he had marched his army down the west bank of the river, crossed below the city, and approached Vicksburg from the rear, cutting it off from reinforcement and supply. The siege had been a nightmare for the civilians trapped in Vicksburg. Confederate and Union artillery had pounded the city day and night, forcing residents to live in caves dug into the hillsides. Food had become scarce, and people had been reduced to eating rats, mules, and shoe leather. When the city finally surrendered, the garrison was starving, and the civilian population was on the verge of collapse. Grant's victory at Vicksburg made him the most successful Union general, and brought him to Lincoln's attention as a possible commander for all Union armies. Unlike the cautious generals who had commanded in the East, Grant understood that the war was about destroying the enemy's ability to fight, not just winning battles. He was willing to accept heavy casualties if it meant achieving decisive results. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. The South had lost its best chance to win the war through military victory, and the Union was finally beginning to use its superior resources effectively. But the war was far from over, and the Confederacy would continue to fight with desperate courage for nearly 2 more years. The summer of 1863 also saw the first large-scale use of African American troops in combat. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments recruited in the North, led an assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor on July 18th. The attack failed, and the regiment suffered heavy casualties, including its white colonel, Robert Gould Shaw. But the courage displayed by the 54th Massachusetts helped change Northern attitudes toward black soldiers. Frederick Douglass had argued that military service would be the key to full citizenship for African Americans, and the performance of black troops in battle proved his point. By the end of the war, black soldiers would make up 10% of the Union Army and would play a crucial role in their own liberation. The year 1863 ended with mixed results for both sides. The Union had won decisive victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but it had also suffered defeats at Chickamauga and Chancellorsville. The Confederacy was clearly on the defensive, but it still had capable armies and determined leaders. The war would continue, but the momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Union. As 1864 began, Lincoln faced a presidential election that would determine not just his own political future, but the fate of the Union cause. If he lost, his successor might negotiate a peace that would leave the Confederacy independent and slavery intact. Everything depended on the military campaigns of the coming year and the Union's ability to bring the war to a successful conclusion. The dawn of 1864 found Abraham Lincoln facing the greatest challenge of his presidency. The war had dragged on for nearly 3 years, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars. Northern morale was wavering, and the upcoming presidential election loomed as a potential disaster for the Republican Party and the Union cause. Lincoln knew that he needed decisive military victories to maintain public support for the war. The president's search for a general who could match Robert E. Lee's tactical brilliance finally ended with Ulysses S. Grant. The victor of Vicksburg had proven that he understood modern warfare. It was not enough to win battles. You had to destroy the enemy's ability to continue fighting. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies, giving him unprecedented authority to coordinate the war effort. Grant's strategy for 1864 was elegantly simple: apply pressure everywhere simultaneously, preventing the Confederates from shifting troops to meet threats. While he accompanied the Army of the Potomac in its advance on Richmond, William Tecumseh Sherman would march from Tennessee toward Atlanta, Nathaniel Banks would advance up the Red River in Louisiana, and Benjamin Butler would threaten Richmond from the south via the James River. The plan represented a fundamental shift in Union strategy. Previous campaigns had been piecemeal affairs, with armies operating independently and often at cross purposes. Grant understood that the Union's greatest advantage was its superior numbers, but this advantage could only be exploited through coordinated action. The Confederacy would be forced to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, stretching its limited resources to the breaking point. Grant's first test came in the tangled wilderness of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, where Lee had defeated Hooker the previous year. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought on May 5th and 6th, 1864, was a confused and bloody affair fought in dense woods that negated the Union's advantages in artillery and numbers. Soldiers fought at close range, often unable to see their enemies through the thick underbrush. The battle was a tactical victory for Lee, who inflicted heavier casualties on Grant than he suffered himself. But Grant's response to the defeat revealed why he was different from previous Union commanders. Instead of retreating across the Rappahannock, as his predecessors had done, Grant ordered his army to continue south, attempting to get between Lee and Richmond. The soldiers of the Army of the Potomac, accustomed to retreat after every encounter with Lee, were amazed when they realized they were advancing. Cheers erupted along the column as word spread that unconditional surrender Grant was not giving up. For the first time in the war, Lee was being forced to react to Union movements rather than dictating the course of events. The two armies raced toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, with Lee's forces arriving just in time to block Grant's advance. The resulting battle lasted for 2 weeks, with both sides constructing elaborate earthworks and engaging in some of the most savage fighting of the war. The climax came on May 12th, at a salient in the Confederate line known as the Bloody Angle, where hand-to-hand combat raged for 20 hours. The fighting at the Bloody Angle was so intense that a 22-inch oak tree was cut down by rifle fire alone. Soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and even their bare hands in trenches filled with mud and blood. One participant described it as the most terrible 20 hours in the history of warfare, and the carnage was so great that the dead were piled 3 deep in some places. Grant's losses in the Wilderness and Spotsylvania campaigns were staggering, over 36,000 casualties in less than 2 weeks. Northern newspapers began calling him the Butcher, and there were demands for his removal. But Lincoln stood by his general, understanding that Grant was finally applying the kind of pressure that could break the Confederacy's will to fight. The campaign continued with the Battle of Cold Harbor on June 3rd, where Grant ordered a frontal assault on Lee's entrenched positions that resulted in 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour. It was Grant's worst tactical defeat, and he later wrote that he regretted ordering the attack. But even this disaster did not deter him from his ultimate objective, the destruction of Lee's army. Unable to break through Lee's defenses, Grant executed a brilliant strategic maneuver, moving his entire army across the James River to threaten Petersburg, the railroad hub that supplied Richmond. If Petersburg fell, the Confederate capital would be untenable, and Lee's army would be forced to retreat or starve. The move caught Lee by surprise and nearly succeeded, but Confederate reinforcements arrived just in time to save the city. The failure to capture Petersburg immediately led to a siege that would last for 10 months. Both armies dug elaborate trench systems that stretched for miles around the city, creating a preview of the Western Front in World War I. The siege warfare was a new experience for American soldiers, who had to adapt to life in muddy trenches under constant threat from snipers and artillery. While Grant was grinding away at Lee's army in Virginia, Sherman was conducting his own campaign in Georgia. The march to Atlanta was a masterpiece of maneuver warfare, with Sherman using his superior numbers to outflank Confederate positions rather than attacking them directly. General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in Georgia, conducted a skillful fighting retreat, but he was unable to stop Sherman's advance. Jefferson Davis, frustrated by Johnston's defensive strategy, replaced him with John Bell Hood, an aggressive general who had lost a leg at Chickamauga. Hood immediately went on the offensive, launching a series of attacks on Sherman's forces around Atlanta. But Hood's attacks were poorly coordinated and costly failures that weakened his army, without achieving any strategic objectives. Sherman's capture of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, was a crucial victory for the Union cause. The city was a major industrial center and railroad hub, and its fall dealt a severe blow to Confederate morale. More importantly for Lincoln, the victory came just 2 months before the presidential election and helped ensure his re-election. The Democratic Party had nominated George B. McClellan, Grant's predecessor as commander of the Army of the Potomac, on a platform calling for an immediate armistice and peace negotiations. McClellan himself was not a peace candidate, but his running mate and many of his supporters favored ending the war even if it meant Confederate independence. Lincoln's re-election was by no means certain. The war had lasted much longer than anyone had expected, and the casualties were mounting daily. Draft riots had erupted in New York City the previous year, and there was growing opposition to the war among working-class Democrats who resented fighting for the freedom of enslaved people who might compete with them for jobs. But Sherman's victory at Atlanta changed the political landscape. Suddenly, it appeared that the Union was winning the war, and voters were reluctant to change leadership at such a crucial moment. Lincoln won a decisive victory, carrying all but 3 states and receiving 55% of the popular vote. The election was a referendum on the war, and the American people had voted to see it through to victory. Lincoln's re-election ensured that the war would continue until the Confederacy was completely defeated and slavery was abolished. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, Lincoln struck a note of reconciliation while making clear his determination to finish the work of emancipation. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," he declared, "let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." But before reconciliation could come, the Confederacy had to be completely defeated. Sherman's march to the sea, which began after the fall of Atlanta, was designed to break the South's will to continue fighting. Sherman's 60,000 men cut a swath of destruction 60 miles wide across Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and anything else that could support the Confederate war effort. The march was controversial even among Union supporters who questioned the morality of making war on civilians. But Sherman believed that the South's civilian population was as much a part of the war effort as its soldiers, and that breaking their morale was essential to ending the conflict. "War is hell," he famously declared, and he was determined to make the South feel the full weight of that hell. Sherman's army reached Savannah on December 21, 1864, completing a march of 300 miles in just over a month. The city surrendered without a fight, and Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton." The march to the sea was followed by an even more destructive campaign through South Carolina, the state that had started the war. Sherman's men, many of whom blamed South Carolina for the conflict, were particularly harsh in their treatment of the state. Columbia, the state capital, was burned, though whether by accident or design remains a matter of historical debate. The destruction of South Carolina marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Lee's army was trapped in the trenches around Petersburg, slowly starving and bleeding to death. Johnston's army in North Carolina was too weak to stop Sherman's advance. The Confederate government was preparing to evacuate Richmond, and there was talk of continuing the war as a guerrilla conflict in the mountains. But Lee understood that further resistance would only bring more suffering to the South. His army was down to fewer than 30,000 effective men, many of them barefoot and hungry. Desertions were increasing daily as soldiers slipped away to return to their families. The cause was lost, and Lee knew it. The end came suddenly in April 1865. Grant's final offensive broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing the Confederate Army to abandon its positions and attempt to retreat westward. But Union cavalry and infantry cut off Lee's escape routes, and on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The surrender ceremony was conducted with dignity and respect for the defeated Confederates. Grant forbade his men from celebrating, telling them, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." Lee's soldiers were allowed to keep their horses and sidearms, and they were given food from Union supplies. It was a generous peace that reflected Lincoln's desire for reconciliation, but Lincoln would not live to see the fruits of his magnanimity. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, the president was shot by actor John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning, becoming a martyr to the cause of union and freedom that he had championed throughout the war. The assassination of Lincoln was a tragedy for the nation, and particularly for the South. Lincoln had favored a lenient Reconstruction policy that would have quickly restored the Southern states to the Union with minimal punishment. His successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked Lincoln's political skills and moral authority, and the Reconstruction period would be marked by bitterness and conflict that lasted for generations. The American Civil War officially ended on May 26, 1865, when the last Confederate forces surrendered. The cost had been enormous: over 600,000 dead, millions more wounded, and entire regions of the country devastated. But the Union had been preserved, slavery had been abolished, and the United States had emerged as a modern nation-state with a strong federal government. The war had transformed American society in fundamental ways. The federal government had assumed powers that would have been unthinkable before the conflict, including the right to conscript soldiers, issue paper money, and regulate the economy. The industrial capacity that had been built up to support the war effort would fuel America's emergence as a world power in the decades to come. For African Americans, the war had brought freedom but not equality. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, and the 14th and 15th Amendments would guarantee citizenship and voting rights. But the promise of Reconstruction would be betrayed by the Compromise of 1877, which ended federal protection for black rights in exchange for Republican control of the presidency. The Civil War had settled the questions that had plagued the nation since its founding. The Union was perpetual, and slavery was incompatible with American ideals of freedom and equality. But it had also raised new questions about the role of government, the meaning of citizenship, and the nature of American democracy that would continue to challenge the nation for generations to come. The spring of 1865 found the Confederacy in its death throes, though few were willing to admit it. Richmond, the proud capital of the rebellion, had become a city under siege, its streets filled with refugees, wounded soldiers, and the desperate families of Confederate officials. The government, that had once dreamed of independence, now struggled simply to survive from day to day. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, remained defiant, even as his nation crumbled around him. He spoke of moving the government south and continuing the fight as a guerrilla war, but these were the fantasies of a man who could not accept defeat. The reality was that the Confederacy was finished as a functioning nation, its armies scattered, its treasury empty, and its people exhausted by 4 years of devastating war. Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia in the trenches around Petersburg, understood the situation better than his president. His once mighty army had been reduced to fewer than 30,000 effective men, many of them barefoot, hungry, and armed with obsolete weapons. Desertions were increasing daily as soldiers slipped away to return to their families and farms. The siege of Petersburg had lasted through the winter of 1864 to 1865, with both armies enduring the misery of trench warfare. The Confederate lines stretched for 37 miles around the city, far too long for Lee's diminished forces to defend effectively. Grant, meanwhile, continued to extend his lines westward, forcing Lee to stretch his army ever thinner. The end began on March 29, 1865, when Grant launched his final offensive. The Battle of Five Forks on April 1st broke the Confederate right flank, cutting the last railroad line into Petersburg. Lee's position was now untenable, and he ordered the evacuation of both Petersburg and Richmond. The fall of Richmond sent shockwaves throughout the South. The city that had symbolized Confederate resistance for 4 years was now in Union hands, its government buildings occupied by black soldiers who had once been enslaved. Abraham Lincoln himself visited the fallen capital on April 4th, walking through the streets where Jefferson Davis had once held court. Lee's army, retreating westward from Petersburg, was in desperate condition. The men had not been properly fed in weeks, and many were too weak to march effectively. Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan harassed the retreating columns, while Grant's infantry pressed close behind. It was a race against time. with Lee hoping to reach the mountains of Western Virginia where he might continue the fight. But Grant's forces were faster and better supplied. On April 6th, at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, Union forces captured nearly 8,000 Confederate soldiers, including several generals. Lee's army was disintegrating, with entire units simply laying down their arms and surrendering. The proud Army of Northern Virginia, which had won so many victories against overwhelming odds, was finally beaten. On the morning of April 9th, 1865, Lee found his path blocked by Union cavalry at Appomattox Courthouse. A final charge by Confederate infantry briefly broke through the Union lines, but it was too late. Grant's infantry was arriving in overwhelming numbers, and Lee's escape route was cut off. The Confederate commander faced a terrible choice: surrender or see his remaining men slaughtered in a hopeless battle. Lee chose surrender, sending a white flag to Grant's lines and requesting a meeting to discuss terms. The two generals met in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house, the same man who had fled Bull Run 4 years earlier to escape the war, only to have it end in his new home. The irony was not lost on observers, who noted that the war had begun in McLean's backyard and ended in his front parlor. Grant's terms were generous, reflecting Lincoln's desire for a magnanimous peace. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms and personal property, while enlisted men could keep their horses for spring plowing. No one would be prosecuted for treason, and all would be free to return home as long as they obeyed the laws. It was a far more lenient surrender than Lee had any right to expect. The formal surrender ceremony took place on April 12th, with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, chosen to receive the Confederate surrender. As the Confederate units marched past to stack their arms and surrender their battle flags, Chamberlain ordered his men to present arms in salute to their defeated foes. It was a gesture of respect that helped begin the healing process between North and South. But even as Lee was surrendering at Appomattox, a terrible tragedy was unfolding in Washington. John Wilkes Booth, a prominent actor and Confederate sympathizer, had been planning to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for Confederate prisoners. When that plan failed, Booth decided on assassination, believing that killing Lincoln would somehow revive the Confederate cause. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. The president was in good spirits, having just received news of Lee's surrender. He had spoken earlier that day about his plans for Reconstruction, emphasizing reconciliation and healing rather than punishment for the defeated South. Booth entered the presidential box during the third act of the play, when the audience's laughter would mask the sound of his pistol. He shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a single-shot derringer, then leaped to the stage shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia. Booth broke his leg in the jump, but managed to escape on horseback. Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across the street from the theater, where doctors examined his wound and pronounced it fatal. The bullet had lodged in his brain, and there was nothing that 19th-century medicine could do to save him. Through the long night, government officials, family members, and friends kept vigil as the president slowly died. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, becoming the first American president to be assassinated. His death sent shockwaves throughout the nation and the world. The man who had preserved the Union and freed the slaves had been struck down at the moment of his greatest triumph. The assassination was part of a larger conspiracy that included attacks on other government officials. Lewis Powell, one of Booth's co-conspirators, severely wounded Secretary of State William Seward in his home, while George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve. The plot to decapitate the Union government had largely failed, but the death of Lincoln was catastrophe enough. Booth was hunted down and killed by Union soldiers on April 26, 1865, in a tobacco barn in Virginia. His co-conspirators were captured, tried by military tribunal, and 4 were executed, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the federal government. The swift justice reflected the nation's anger and desire for revenge. Lincoln's death was mourned throughout the North and by many in the South, who recognized that they had lost their best hope for a lenient Reconstruction. The president's body was carried by funeral train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, with millions of Americans lining the tracks to pay their respects. It was the largest funeral in American history up to that time, The assassination elevated Lincoln to martyrdom and ensured his place as one of America's greatest presidents. The man who had been reviled by many during his lifetime was now seen as the great emancipator who had died for the cause of freedom. His death also ensured that Reconstruction would be harsher than he had intended, as radical Republicans gained control of the process. Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's death, was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union. But he lacked Lincoln's political skills and moral authority, and his lenient policies toward the South soon brought him into conflict with Congress. The Reconstruction period would be marked by bitter political battles that would last for more than a decade. The war officially ended on May 26, 1865, when the last Confederate forces surrendered in Texas. But the process of reuniting the nation would take much longer. The South was devastated, its cities burned, its railroads destroyed, and its economy in ruins. The task of rebuilding would require enormous effort and resources. The human cost of the war was staggering. Over 620,000 Americans had died, more than in all other American wars combined. Hundreds of thousands more had been wounded, many permanently disabled. Entire families had been wiped out, and the demographic impact would be felt for generations. The economic cost was equally enormous. The federal government had spent over $3 billion on the war, creating a national debt that would take decades to pay off. The South's economy had been completely destroyed, with property values collapsing and the labor system based on slavery eliminated overnight. But the war had also brought positive changes. Slavery had been abolished forever, fulfilling the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The federal government had been strengthened and modernized, with new institutions and capabilities that would serve the nation well in the industrial age. The war had also accelerated technological and social changes that were already underway. The railroad network had been expanded and improved. Telegraphs connected distant parts of the country, and new manufacturing techniques had been developed. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and their contributions to the war effort had begun to change attitudes about their capabilities and rights. For African Americans, the war had brought freedom but not equality. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, but the struggle for civil rights would continue for another century. The promises of Reconstruction would be betrayed by the Compromise of 1877, which ended federal protection for black rights in exchange for Republican control of the presidency. The Civil War had settled the fundamental questions that had plagued the nation since its founding. The Union was perpetual and indissoluble, and no state could secede from it. Slavery was incompatible with American ideals and had been abolished forever. The federal government was supreme over the states, and the Constitution was the supreme law of the land. But the war had also raised new questions about the nature of American democracy and the meaning of citizenship. The expansion of federal power during the war had created precedents that would be used to justify further government intervention in the economy and society. The struggle for racial equality would continue long after the last shots were fired. The memory of the Civil War would shape American politics and culture for generations to come. Veterans organizations would become powerful political forces, and the Grand Army of the Republic would help elect Republican presidents for decades. The Lost Cause mythology would romanticize the Confederacy and help justify the system of racial segregation that replaced slavery. The battlefields where so many Americans had died would become sacred ground, preserved as national parks and monuments to the sacrifice of those who had fought and died. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, and dozens of other sites would become pilgrimage destinations for Americans seeking to understand their history and honor their ancestors. The Civil War had been the defining event in American history, transforming the United States from a loose confederation of states into a modern nation. The country that emerged from the war was stronger, more unified, and more committed to the ideals of freedom and equality. But it was also scarred by the experience, and the wounds would take generations to heal. As the guns fell silent and the soldiers returned home, Americans faced the enormous task of rebuilding their nation. The physical destruction could be repaired with time and effort, but the psychological and emotional wounds would prove more difficult to heal. The war had ended, but its legacy would endure for generations to come. The American Civil War had been a tragedy of immense proportions, but it had also been a triumph of the human spirit. In the darkest hours of the conflict, Americans had shown remarkable courage, determination, and sacrifice. They had fought not just for territory or political power, but for their deepest beliefs about freedom, equality, and the nature of government. The war had tested the American experiment in democracy and found it strong enough to survive even the most severe challenges. The Union had been preserved, slavery had been abolished, and the nation had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. It was a victory that had been purchased with blood and treasure, but it was a victory that would benefit not just Americans, but people around the world who looked to the United States as a beacon of freedom and democracy. The story of the American Civil War is ultimately a story about the power of ideas and the willingness of people to sacrifice everything for what they believe in. It is a reminder that freedom is never free, that democracy requires constant vigilance and effort to maintain, and that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. The men and women who fought and died in that great conflict left us a legacy that we must never forget, and a responsibility that we must never shirk. As we remember the American Civil War today, we honor not just the soldiers who fought and died, but all those who worked to preserve the Union and extend the blessings of freedom to all Americans. Their sacrifice was not in vain, for they helped create a nation that, despite its flaws and failures, remains a beacon of hope and freedom to the world. The war that tore America apart ultimately made it stronger, and the lessons learned in that great conflict continue to guide us today as we work to build a more perfect union.